Japan. A land far away, mysterious, but strangely attractive. What is this country all about? What's its story? That's what we're here to find out. In a previous episode we talked about the beginnings of Japan, from prehistory all the way to its ascendance into the modern age. We talked about samurais, civil wars and shoguns and everything in between. But as fascinating as it was, Japan's modern history is mind-blowing. From its rise to a huge empire, to ruin, and then back to glory again. Hi, welcome to 7 Facts. Join me as we talk about how Japan reached its lowest and highest points in history during the 20th century. So first, to recap. Humans arrived to the Japanese archipelago over 30,000 years ago, but it wasn't until the 4th century BC that the cultures of the island started to coagulate and began their journey towards forming the Japanese nation. As kingdoms formed, they fought each other because, well, that's what humans do, but eventually they unified under a single emperor. The many emperors that followed were, most of the time, powerless, as more powerful noblemen and soldiers, samurais, daimyos and shoguns were effectively controlling the empire. It wasn't until 1868 that Emperor Meiji managed to retake full political control and end the shogunate era. That was the beginning of Japan's modernization, its lift out of isolation and the birth of an ambitious and expansionist country. They wanted to be taken seriously and be on equal footing, at least, with the Western powers, and in order to do that, well, that's what we're here to discuss. So let's continue. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, a war that would quickly engulf most of the world. Yes, we're talking about World War I, and yes, Japan participated. They joined the Entente powers, asking in return Germany's colonial territories in the Pacific. Japan quickly seized the Mariana, Caroline and the Marshall Islands with virtually no resistance. They also expanded their influence over China, and the Imperial Army doubled its budget and gained a lot of political influence. In the aftermath of the war, Japan became a founding member of the League of Nations, where they came with a proposal. They wanted to include a racial equality clause in the Covenant of the League, but with the US and the UK opposing the proposal, it didn't pass. This moment was one of the causes of Japan's steep alienation from the Western powers. The rejection of Japan's proposal was later used to rationalize nationalism and militarism within the empire. Despite these setbacks, Japan was now a major global power. But soon things would turn for the worst. Inflation was rising, there was political ferment in the streets, and to top it all off, on September 1st, 1923, a powerful earthquake left 100,000 dead and 3 million homeless. At the same time, while there was an effort to maintain a democratic system, militarism and nationalism were on the rise, fueled by a disillusioned public with Western ideals, the spread of communism and fascism, and the achievements of the Navy. In 1921, Japan launched the first purpose-designed aircraft carrier, the Hosho, further building an entire fleet that was second to none. In 1926, the reigning Emperor Taisho dies, and his son became emperor, now referred to as Emperor Showa, but known to the rest of the world by his given name, Hirohito. Under Hirohito, a combination of political ideologies mixed and formed what is called the Showa statism. It was a combination of Japanese ultranationalism, militarism, fascism, and state capitalism. It is often labeled as Japanese fascism, so you can sort of imagine what this ideology was like. In 1931, an incident occurred on the South Manchuria Railroad owned by Japan. A group of radical officers bombed the railroad, blamed the Chinese, and then invaded Manchuria. A new puppet state, Manchukuo, was established that sparked international criticism, and in response, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations. After that, Japan's expansionist vision grew increasingly bold. Many of the country's political elite, who by now were mostly on the far right, wanted Japan to acquire new territory for resource extraction and settlement of the surplus population. With a powerful army and ultranationalism everywhere, it was a matter of time before a large-scale war erupted. And erupt it did. On July 7, 1937, one of the soldiers guarding the rail line between Beijing and Tianjin disappeared. The Japanese commander demanded the right to search for the missing soldier over the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, but was denied. Both armies were put on high alert and soon shots were fired, even though by this time the missing soldier was found. This was the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War and is now often regarded as the beginning of World War II in Asia. In less than 6 months, Japanese troops conquered the then capital of China, Nanjing, and what followed was a horrific outburst of violence against the locals. It is called the Nanjing Massacre or the Rape of Nanjing, a period of 6 weeks during which Japanese soldiers engaged in looting, arson, mass rapes, and even massacre contests. It's estimated that 200,000 people were violently murdered and 20,000 women were raped. This massacre was one of the worst atrocities committed during World War II. In response to these events, the United States imposed economic sanctions intended to deprive Japan of the resources it needed to continue the war. Japan reacted and formed an alliance with Germany and Italy in 1940, the infamous Axis powers. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt transferred many of the Navy's ships to Pearl Harbor to discourage a potential Japanese incursion. In September that year, Japan invaded French Indochina, and the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands froze all Japanese assets. The stage was now set for total war. Pressured by embargoes and in desperate need for fuel and other resources, Japan decided to deal with the United States. They executed the plan of Marshal Admirals Nagano and Yamamoto to bomb the US naval base in Hawaii. On December 7, 1941, Japan near-simultaneously attacked Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Thailand, and Hong Kong. They wanted to incapacitate the US and the UK long enough for Japan to establish a Southeast Asian empire with defensible buffer zones. The attack on Pearl Harbor left over 2,000 dead, 47 ships and 390 aircrafts destroyed, but it produced little lasting damage to the American Navy. Instead, it rallied the American nation against Japan, Germany and Italy, and the United States entered the bloody stages of World War II. From March to June 1942, Japan survived intense battles with the Allies and managed to conquer Singapore, Guam, the Philippines, and established its control in Indonesia, Malaysia and Burma. To gain the local support, they removed the old colonial regimes and granted limited autonomy in some territories in exchange for loyalty. Meanwhile, they continued to commit atrocities in China and Singapore, engaged in the execution and harsh treatment of Allied POWs, and conducted gruesome biological experiments through the infamous Unit 731, the details of which I'm not gonna discuss here. The Japanese onslaught was stopped in its tracks in May 1942 when a fleet heading to South New Guinea was defeated in the Coral Sea. Then, in June, Japan received a mighty blow at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto gathered a formidable force of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines and destroyers for a surprise attack on the American fleet stationed at Midway Island. However, by this time the Americans figured out the Japanese coded messages and were waiting for Yamamoto. Japan lost its main carrier fleet, 250 airplanes and over 3,000 soldiers, including hundreds of experienced pilots. Beginning from 1943, the Pacific stage of World War II turned in favor of the Allies. The United States turned on its wartime industrial machine, and it showed. Japan had a hard time resisting enemy forces and was no longer able to hold its occupied territories. In 1944, Burma and the Philippines were lost to Japan, and in 1945 the Americans attacked the island of Iwo Jima. For over a month, the two sides fought each other. 7,000 Americans died, nearly 20,000 were wounded, hundreds of airplanes and tanks were destroyed. But Japan lost more than 18,000 soldiers and Iwo Jima was lost. The US now had a very close base from which it could launch air raid after air raid on Japan. They undertook an intense strategic bombing campaign using incendiary bombs. The idea was to destroy Japan's industry and shatter its morale. It worked. But at the same time, some 500,000 civilians died as a result, 100,000 of which died on March 9 during an air raid on Tokyo. This was an all-out war, just like in Europe, and the Allies were winning. But the Japanese were still refusing to surrender. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was leveled by an atomic bomb. 3 days later, Nagasaki was pulverized. Between 130 and 220,000 people died in the blast and in the following months from radiation poisoning. Finally, Japan agreed on an unconditional surrender. World War II was over. Between 1945 and 1952, Japan was occupied and administered by Allied forces. This was the first and only time in Japanese history that the country was occupied by foreign powers. Emperor Hirohito was granted full immunity to ensure the nation's cooperation. He remained emperor, but General Douglas MacArthur was the de facto leader of Japan. In 1946, Hirohito formally renounced his claimed divinity, and in 1947 a new constitution was adopted that stated that the emperor was a mere symbol of the state. Back in 1868, Hirohito's grandfather, Emperor Meiji, restored the political powers of the monarchy. Less than 100 years later, his grandson would lose them again. The occupation of Japan sought to decentralize power, transfer ownership of agricultural land from landlords to tenant farmers, promote labor unionism, demilitarize the country, and consolidate a functional democracy. The cabinet of Japan, its government, no longer answered to the emperor but to the parliament, the national diet. Civil liberties, labor rights, and women's suffrage were encoded in the new constitution. The military was disarmed, the colonies were granted independence, and the colonists were returned back to Japan. In September 1951, the Treaty of San Francisco was signed, which re-established peaceful relations between Japan and the Allied powers on behalf of the United Nations. It came into effect on April 28, 1952, thus ending the occupation and restoring full sovereignty to Japan. Despite this, 260,000 American soldiers remained based on mainland Japan, plus tens of thousands on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. To this day, American soldiers remain stationed in Japanese bases, some 30,000 or more. The Japanese economy was in bad shape after the war ended, but that would change in less than a decade. Japan chose to forge a tight relationship with the United States and focus on developing the economy rather than pursuing a proactive foreign policy. It implemented an austerity program that ended inflation in 1949. Manufacturing, heavy industry, and exports were encouraged, technology and quality control techniques from the West were adopted. Close cooperation with the US, non-tariff barriers to imports, long work hours, and a system of lifetime employment, all of these measures came together and created what is now called the Japanese economic miracle. By 1955, the nation's economy had grown beyond pre-war levels, and by 1968 it became the second largest capitalist economy in the world. During this period, Japan became the world's largest manufacturer of automobiles and a leading producer of electronics. The Tokyo Stock Exchange became the largest in the world. Life expectancy rose and living standards were at an all-time high. A new, wealthy, democratic and capitalist Japan arose from the literal ashes left behind by World War II. But no miracle lasts forever. In 1989, the economic miracle ended and economic stagnation followed. These were the lost decades. From 1991 onwards, the economy basically stalled. It was triggered by inflated real estate and stock market prices, a bubble that burst in 1992. The stagnation led to a steady fall of the country's GDP, a slight fall in wages and living standards. In 2008, the global financial crisis occurred, then in 2011 the Tohuku Earthquake and tsunami, the fourth largest in recorded history, devastated eastern Japan. It also caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster. These two calamities had a price tag of $34 billion, further causing an economic loss of $235 billion, making the earthquake the costliest natural disaster in history. And then 2020 came and the world was enveloped in the COVID-19 pandemic, which again caused a recession. But despite the hardships, the last decades also coincide with the rise of Japanese popular culture. Video games, music, comic books, anime, manga, cinema, and cuisine have become among the most prominent pop cultures around the entire world. Japanese brands like Toyota, Sony, Toshiba, or Panasonic still hold strong in the world economy. There is, however, a shift occurring at present. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and China flexed its muscles around Taiwan. and North Korea is an ever-present, now nuclear threat. These events raised tensions not just in Japan but worldwide. And it caused a shift in Japan's policy, with the country now once more increasing its military spending, eroding its pacifist stance. But as to what will happen next, we can't know for sure. Japan's fascinating history is still in the making. I hope this video was interesting enough to have inspired you to look into it further on your own. If you liked it, leave a like and subscribe. You can leave your comments downstairs, and you can also check out my Patreon page if you want to support me. The link is in the description. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.